I want to tell you a story that still blows my mind. When I first heard about what happened off the coast of British Columbia in October 2019, I thought it was just another urban legend. But the deeper I dug, the more I realized it really happened. David Mackenzie was a professional diver with 20 years' experience. 42 years old, strong build, calm character. He lived in the small town of Tofino on Vancouver Island, where the ocean was not just a job, but part of his soul. Every morning he would look at the water and know that today I would dive again. David made his money by harvesting seafood, scallops, sea urchins, sometimes crabs. But the most valued of all were abalones, large sea clams which local restaurants bought for $100 a kilo. You could get a decent amount of money in a day if you knew the right places. On that October morning, the ocean was as calm as glass. Visibility underwater was about 15 meters, which was considered excellent for this area. David loaded his boat with the usual gear: wetsuit, tanks, and catch nets. He headed for a familiar reef 20 minutes offshore. It was 30 meters deep and covered with algae and rocks, the perfect place for clams. David had dived here hundreds of times and knew every ledge, every crevice. The dive started as usual. David gently lowered himself to the bottom, turned on his underwater flashlight, and began to examine the rocks. He found the first abalones quickly, large, beautiful shells clinging tightly to the rock surface. He carefully picked them up with his knife and put them in a net. After about half an hour of work, something changed. At first, David felt it intuitively, as if someone was watching. He turned around and saw a shadow, a large black and white shadow that slid slowly in the distance between the seaweed. Orca, an adult about 7 meters long. David froze, trying not to make any sudden movements. In all the years he'd been underwater, he'd met these mammals only a few times, and each time they just swam by, ignoring him. But this orca behaved differently. It didn't swim away. On the contrary, it started circling around David, gradually narrowing its circles. Its movements were smooth, almost hypnotic, but there was something sinister in them. David decided to finish the dive. He slowly began to surface, controlling the rate of decompression, but the orca kept up. She came up with him, keeping a few meters away. Sometimes it would disappear from sight, and David thought it was over, but then it would reappear, either from the side or from below. At a depth of 15 meters, something hard to believe happened. The orca accelerated sharply and was directly above David. Its massive body blocked the sunlight streaming in from the surface. David tried to swim away, but the orca followed his every move. When he tried to surface, the orca went lower, effectively blocking his way up. Her huge head was only a meter from David's face. He could see her iron, intelligent, deliberate gaze that seemed to be studying him. David checked the pressure gauge. There was about 10 minutes of air left with normal breathing, but his heart was beating so fast that the flow rate had doubled. Panic was starting to creep up his throat, but he forced himself to stay calm. The cardinal rule of diving is never to panic underwater. He tried to go around the orca from the left. The animal reacted instantly, blocking this way. David tried it from the right. The result was the same. The orca moved with incredible precision, as if anticipating his every intention. Another 5 minutes passed. The air was critically short. David realized that a decision had to be made immediately. He removed the emergency load from his belt and threw it down sharply, hoping to distract the orca. The animal looked at the falling weight but did not move. David tried to surface sharply, ignoring the rules of decompression, but the orca was faster. She turned around and blocked the way up again. Now she was even closer. David could see every detail of her skin, the scars from old wounds, the white spots on her head. We were running out of air. The pressure gauge was showing the red zone. David had a spare regulator, but it only gave a few minutes of breathing time for an emergency surfacing. David turned it on and took a deep breath. At that moment, the orca did something unexpected. It made a sound, a low, vibrating cry that David felt with his whole body. Immediately, other voices responded. A second orca appeared on the right, then a third. There were 5 of them in all. David found himself in the center of a group of orcas. They surrounded him in a tight ring, preventing him from moving in any direction. Their synchronized movements resembled some ancient ritual. Sometimes one of the orcas came so close that David could touch it with his hand. The spare air was running out. David felt his consciousness begin to cloud from the lack of oxygen. He realized it was the end. To surface without air from a depth of 15 meters meant certain death by decompression sickness or drowning. But then a miracle happened. The eldest orca, the one that had first appeared, slowly swam away. The others followed. The ring opened, and the way up was free. David didn't hesitate. He began an emergency surfacing, breaking all safety rules. With the last breath of his spare air, he reached the surface. His lungs were burning from lack of oxygen, his ears were ringing, but he was alive. The boat was bobbing about 20 meters away. David reached it, struggled to get in, and fell to the bottom, breathing hard. Only then did he realize that his whole body was shaking. There were orcas swimming around the boat. They appeared on the surface, exhaled fountains of water, and plunged again. David started the motor and headed for shore. The orcas followed him about halfway and then disappeared into the depths of the ocean. All the way to the harbor, David tried to figure out what had happened. Why wouldn't they let him go? And why did they finally let him go? His wife Sarah was waiting for him at the port. One look at her husband's face was enough to realize that something was wrong. David told her the whole story, and Sarah insisted on seeing a doctor. The examination did not reveal any serious problems, but the doctor warned about the possible consequences of rapid surfacing. David hasn't worked for several days. He sat on the shore and looked out at the ocean, trying to find answers. Local fishermen were skeptical of his story. Orcas are not aggressive to humans, and there have been isolated incidents, but nothing like this has ever been recorded in these waters. But a week later came news that changed everything. A marine biologist from the University of Victoria published an article about the strange behavior of orcas off the coast of British Columbia. Several groups of these animals were showing unusual activity. They were holding divers underwater. Turns out David wasn't the only one. In the last 3 months, 4 more similar cases were registered. In all situations, the orcas did not harm people physically, but prevented them from surfacing for a long time. 2 divers suffered decompression sickness due to emergency surfacing. Biologists have proposed several hypotheses. Orcas may have studied humans, showing curiosity about unfamiliar creatures in their habitat. Or it may have been a defensive reaction to changes in the ocean, pollution, noise from ships, diminishing food resources. The third version seemed to me the most interesting. Some scientists have suggested that the orcas were trying to communicate something. These animals are highly intelligent and have a complex social structure. Perhaps they were using the only way available to them to draw attention to the problems of the ocean. David returned to work a month later, but now he only dived in pairs with his partner and always kept in touch with the surface. Orcas no longer bothered him, but he often saw them in the distance. Each time he noticed the distinctive dorsal fins, he remembered that day. Sarah insisted that David tell his story to the local newspaper. The article was titled, "Orca Encounter, Mysticism or Science." The story attracted the attention of marine life researchers and journalists. David was invited to appear on several radio programs. But the most important meeting was with Dr. Mary Harrison, a leading orca behaviorist in Canada. She has studied these animals for 20 years and claimed that their behavior has changed dramatically over the last decade. Orcas are becoming more aggressive to human activity, Dr. Harrison explained. They're starting to see us as a threat, and maybe trying to let us know that we're going too far in destroying their world. She told about other cases of unusual orca behavior. In Spain, they attacked yachts, damaging rudders and hulls. Off the coast of Alaska, a group of orcas surrounded a tourist boat and held it under siege for several hours. All these incidents have occurred in recent years. David began to study the subject in more depth. He read dozens of scientific articles, talked to other divers who had similar experiences. The picture was disturbing. The ocean was changing, and its inhabitants were reacting to these changes. Climate change, plastic pollution, noise pollution from ships, and declining fish populations have all put stress on marine mammals. Orcas at the top of the food chain felt these changes more acutely than others. Perhaps what happened to David underwater wasn't just a chance encounter. Maybe the orcas were trying to send a message that their world was being destroyed and they could no longer keep quiet about it. With this story, I wanted to show that the boundary between man and nature is much thinner than we think. David Mackenzie continues to dive, but now he does so with more respect for the ocean and its inhabitants. Each dive reminds him of the day the orcas taught him a lesson that we are not masters of the ocean. We are just guests in a world that existed millions of years before we arrived. And if we don't learn to respect that world, its inhabitants may have to remind us more and more often. I still think about how David felt when he looked into that orca's eyes. What did he see there? Curiosity? A threat? Or a plea for help from a sentient being who could no longer remain silent about the destruction of its home? We'll never know the exact answer. But every time I look at the ocean, I remember this story. And I hope that someday we will learn to listen to what nature is trying to tell us, before it's too late. A year after that incident, I decided to go to Tofino in person. I needed to see the place with my own eyes, to talk to the people who work in these waters every day. David's story kept me on my toes. There were too many unanswered questions. Tofino is a small town on the west coast of Vancouver Island. The population barely exceeds 2,000 people, but this place is known to surfers and wildlife enthusiasts from all over the world. Ancient forests and the vast Pacific Ocean meet here. David agreed to meet me at a local cafe called Floating Dock. It's a place where fishermen, divers, and marine guides gather. The atmosphere here is special. The walls are hung with photos of successful catches, there are sea charts on the tables, and the smell of salt and coffee in the air. David looked calm, but I noticed him glancing toward the ocean through the window from time to time. You know, he said, stirring his coffee, I thought I'd eventually forget those feelings, but every time I get ready to dive, I remember her eyes. He told me details that didn't make it into the newspaper articles, about how his sleep had changed after the orca encounter. For the first weeks, he had nightmares. He saw himself underwater, surrounded by huge black shadows. He woke up in a cold sweat, gasping for breath. Sarah wanted me to change careers, David continued. She was afraid I might not be so lucky next time. But the ocean is all I know how to do. It's been my life since I was 18. We drove to the harbor where David's boat was parked. It was a small boat, 7 meters long, with a powerful outboard motor and a diving platform. On board, there was a compressor for filling tanks, boxes of equipment, and navigational equipment. This is where I left from that day. David pointed toward the open sea. And over there, beyond those rocks, is where the meeting took place. He pointed to a group of small islets 2 miles offshore. The water around them seemed especially dark and deep. David offered to go there right away. Would you like to see the scene? I don't recommend diving, though. Visibility is poor today, and the current is strong. I agreed, although I had mixed feelings about the idea of being in those waters. We went out to sea in David's boat. The ocean was choppy, meter-high waves rocked the boat, and the wind blew spray off the crests. It's usually quieter out here, David shouted, blocking out the noise of the engine. But the water is always murky after a storm. 20 minutes later, we reached the spot. David turned off the engine, and the boat began to rock on the waves. All around us was a gray-green expanse of water stretching to the horizon. It seemed incredible that somewhere below us, at a depth of 30 meters, that dramatic encounter had taken place. Here, David said, looking into the water. It was about this spot that I first saw her shadow. He pulled out the echo sounder and turned it on. An image of the bottom appeared on the screen, uneven, covered with rocks and algae. The depth showed 28 meters. Suddenly, David was silent. He stared intently toward the nearest islet. See it? He asked in a whisper, pointing with his hand. I followed his gaze and saw a black fin that split the surface of the water 100 meters away from us. Orca. Then a second fin appeared. A third. A whole group of these sea giants moved slowly along the islet. My heart beat faster even from a safe distance. These animals gave the impression of incredible power. Is that them? I asked. David shook his head. I don't know. It could be. Orcas live in families, and these waters are their territory, but there's no way to tell for sure. He started the motor. We'd better not disturb them. On the way back, David told me about other divers who had had similar experiences. Jack Robertson, a 30-year veteran, had encountered an orca at a depth of 20 meters last year. The animal followed him for most of the dive, but did not interfere with his surfacing. A young girl named Emily Chen described how a group of orcas surrounded her at a depth of 15 meters. They swam around her in circles, making sounds she could feel with her whole body. It was like singing, she said. It was like they were trying to tell me something. All these cases had one thing in common. Orcas did not show aggression, but their behavior was radically different from usual. Previously, these animals tried to avoid contact with people. Now they seem to be looking for meetings on purpose. Back in port, we met Dr. Harrison. She had flown in from Victoria specifically to study the local orca population. Over the past 2 years, we have recorded 43 cases of unusual behavior by these animals all along the British Columbia coast, she reported. These meetings used to happen every few years. Now it's every week. Something is causing the orcas to change their behavior, and we're trying to figure out what it is. Dr. Harrison showed me graphs and tables that clearly showed the increase in incidents. One theory linked the change in killer whale behavior to a decline in their main prey, salmon. Pacific salmon populations have dropped 60% in the last 20 years. Hungry orcas have been forced to find new food sources and enter unfamiliar areas. The second theory concerned acoustic pollution. Increased shipping traffic in coastal waters created a constant background of noise that interfered with orcas' ability to hunt and socialize. Perhaps the encounters with divers were attempts to find silence in the underwater world. I found the third version the most intriguing. Some researchers believe that orcas exhibited territorial behavior. They were trying to show people that the underwater world belonged to them, and that humans were just guests. Orcas are some of the most intelligent animals on the planet, Dr. Harrison explained. Their brains are complex, and their social behavior includes elements we are only beginning to understand. They may be capable of more complex thinking than we realized. I spent another 3 days in Tofino talking to the locals. Fishermen told me that orcas had become more frequent in the coastal waters. Tourist guides noted that the animals were no longer afraid of boats and sometimes came very close. Dive center owner Bill Henderson shared his observations. We used to be able to go months without seeing a single orca. Now they show up almost every week, and they're acting weird, like they're studying us. One story in particular struck me. A group of tourist divers from Germany were diving near a local coral reef. Suddenly, 4 orcas appeared and started swimming among the people without showing aggression, but without swimming away. They were there for half an hour, instructor Mike O'Brien recounted. Just swimming around, watching. One tourist tried to touch the orca, but it swam away. It seemed like they had their own rules of the game. On my last day in Tofino, I met up with David again. He was preparing for a dive, this time paired with a partner and in constant communication with the surface. I can't let one incident change my whole life, he said, but now I dive differently. What's changed? I used to feel at home underwater. Now I realize I'm a guest, and I behave accordingly with respect for my hosts. David checked his gear and looked out at the ocean. Maybe that's the lesson they wanted to teach. After returning home, I continued to study the topic of orca-human interactions. Research showed that these animals have cultural traditions that are passed down from generation to generation. Different groups of orcas have their own dialects and hunting techniques. Perhaps the change in orca behavior is a new cultural tradition that is forming right now. A reaction to changes in the ocean, an attempt to adapt to the presence of humans in their habitat. I contacted researchers from other countries where similar cases had been observed. In Norway, orcas have started following fishing boats, demanding their share of the catch. In New Zealand, a group of these animals had learned to take fish from divers without harming them. The pattern was obvious. All over the world, orcas were changing their attitudes toward people. They became bolder, more proactive in contacts, but most importantly, they did not show aggression. On the contrary, it seemed that they were trying to establish new rules of coexistence. David Mackenzie's story has come to symbolize this change. A man who had spent thousands of hours underwater suddenly found himself in a situation where the sea creatures reminded him who was the real master. But most importantly, it made many people look at the ocean in a new way. David began working with environmental organizations, speaking about the need to protect the marine environment. His story became part of documentaries and educational programs,